To another episode of BrainCast. My name's Long, and today I'm joined with Professor Jamie Ward, who is the Director of Sussex Neuroscience and the President of the British Association of Cognitive Neuroscience. So thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.
So how did you get interested in human cognitive neuroscience, and especially the field of individual differences in perceptual experiences?
Yeah, so my background is that I started studying my PhD cases who've had brain damage. So there's an author called Oliver Sacks who published really interesting case studies. There's a famous book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat.
Yeah,
an anthropologist of mine. Yeah. So I love the way that he kind of brought these cases to life, and it was scientific, but it was kind of really exploring different ways of perceiving the world. You can't imagine what it's like to kind of lose half of your vision, or not be able to attend to objects there, or to be able to say nouns but not be able to say verbs, and bizarre things like this. So my PhD was looking at neuropsychology, and this was very much more from brain damage perspective. And then over time, I became interested in the idea that actually people experience the world differently without having a hole in their head, without having a stroke or some other brain damage. It is just the way that their brains are wired. So for me, it's kind of it's the same intellectual tradition, but a whole different kind of evidence base that these kind of unusual cases exist, whether we damage our brain or not. They're just part of human variability.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That book you mentioned is so interesting, isn't it? I remember they said these twins, and you could say, what day of the week to land on in like 400 weeks, and they could give exactly the day of the week and the days.
Yeah, prime numbers was their thing as well. Yeah, so we would now kind of understand that they had like autism, but at the time this wasn't really the scientific evidence base of autism. It's like, what is it?
Yeah, it's super interesting. Yeah. So would you mind giving us like a brief overview of the projects you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So we've just finished a kind of what I call it the 100 Brains project, to collect 100 brain scans of people with synesthesia. So synesthesia is experiencing, for example, colors from music. So you don't just hear music, you might see it. The idea here is that having synesthesia is kind of fascinating in its own right, but actually it's indicating what I would call a kind of neurodiverse phenotype. So synesthetes don't just differ by having unusual experiences. They've got better memory, they're more likely to go into certain occupations and jobs like creative industries. So it's about understanding a kind of more broadly how individual differences in the way people think and behave map onto the brain. The other kind of project which relates to synesthesia, but it's a little bit different, is around sensory sensitivity. So this is more closely linked to autism. So some people, when they listen to, for example, the buzzing of a fluorescent light or certain sounds would drive them mad. They're very sensitive. Going into the shop Lush is just way too kind of overpowering. Often the curious thing about this is that it happens across multiple senses. So we know it's not to do with the eyes or the ears. It's something quite central, and that's obviously distributed, because obviously your hearing and vision senses are not near each other. So it's almost like a brain level difference here that we don't quite understand how this works, but it's clearly something to do with perhaps not being able to predict information accurately, so it always comes as a surprise or overwhelming. That would be one framework. And then there's another condition called misophonia, which is related to sensory sensitivity, but it's very specific to certain sounds, or it appears to be specific. So it might be the sounds of slurping or chewing. Again, it sounds a little bit weird and quirky, but actually for these people, it can be very devastating. They don't eat with their families and so on, because they can't bear to be in the room when somebody's making the sound.
Yeah. Because I remember you released some papers recently about that, didn't you? It sounds pretty good.
Yeah, exactly. We have a research grant looking at this.
Yeah. Well, I was going to you kind of touched on synesthesia then, about what it is, but like, could you develop on some examples of it? You kind of mentioned about like visualizing color in certain ways and stuff, but have you got any other examples?
Sure. Yeah. So the most commonly studied one is having colors for letters and words. So as you look at a black text on a screen, you might see either a colored copy in your mind's eye, or you might literally project on the screen that you'll see they're black, but it's like there's a light shining through. I don't have any of this myself, but this is the way it's described. It's very hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Colors for music is a little bit more like how you would imagine, if you were to paint it, kind of trippy fireworks, pops, bangs, lines, and so on. So a beautiful kind of kaleidoscopic reaction. But you can have it in other senses. So one of the first case studies I came across, my kind of Oliver Sacks type discovery, is a man who tastes words. As you speak to him, it's like an ebb and flow of flavors and things that are on his tongue. One of the other things a type that I suppose I discovered, I mean, most of these things were discovered way before me, is that I sent an email out to undergraduates saying, here's this curious thing, synesthesia. Does anybody think they have this? And somebody said, well, I don't know what this is synesthesia, but when I see somebody being touched, I feel that on my own face. So as I do this, she would feel like a tactile sensation or pressure, like on the mirror image of her cheek.
Wow, that is, before I read some of your stuff, I've never heard of anything like similar to this before. And it must be quite hard to try and understand, because if you can't relate to it at all yourself, it must be really hard to kind of figure out what's going on in these brains and how they're kind of experiencing this,
Yeah, I mean, I think from kind of philosophical point of view, that, there people wonder, is your experience the same as mine? When I see red, is my red the same as your red? And, it's very hard to answer that. But actually, somebody is saying I see red when somebody else is saying I see nothing. So it's not even the same experience. It is something that goes kind of beyond that. Yeah.
But that kind of brings me on to my next question, was like, in one of your papers, you mentioned that we should almost reconsider what we see as a normal neurodevelopmental trajectory into our own kind of experiences of reality. And that word normal, like obviously, like you mentioned there, we all have different ways of taking in reality. So how can you say like what's, the most common, or what's the normal version?
Yeah.
Can you expand on what you meant by that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly don't have any commitment to the word normal. I think the way that I kind of imagine my research is that you're kind of almost chipping away at this idea of normal until there's nothing left. And synesthesia is maybe a few % of the population, but I don't believe that the world is divided into 3% synesthetes and 97% normal or whatever. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think you can take this idea and chip away at it, but I mean, in the old days, everything was divided into normal and abnormal and so on. And this is clearly, I mean, it's not just political correctness, it's just wrong scientifically. There are these variations and spectrums. But I think what we don't have is a clear understanding of what's going to replace that. So we can easily replace it with the idea, well, everybody's unique. But even that doesn't really capture it itself. So if everyone's unique, then everybody has to have their own particular explanation for them. And that's not a scientifically grounded way forward either. So I don't believe that carving the world into normal, abnormal, synesthete, non-synesthete is the right way, but nor do I think that we've got this. So it's almost like there are types, or there might be kind of brain types that you could have, that you identify as having a synesthetic brain type, or kind of autistic trait type, or so on. And you might kind of be at the intersection of multiple Venn diagrams, and this might be a better way of describing that, in effect, that you would have, your brain might be a mixture of, say, 5 or 6 different brain types, including, for example, some of the ones that, that are known, not talked about, like maybe there is a male on average brain type and female brain type, these kind of controversial ideas, there is some scientific kind of credibility behind them. And you might be, a male synesthete high on the autism spectrum, and you've got multiple features across these different traits. And, at this point, what is normal? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, so you kind of mentioned it's not as simple as like black and white and non-synesthetes and synesthetes, So I guess you kind of base it on a spectrum, but has it become hard to kind of where you value that spectrum, because everyone's, everything's different. So are you able to kind of categorize it a bit into certain common traits, or is it completely diverse and different and you can't even put it, in categories or a spectrum,
You kind of can. I mean, the interesting thing about some things is that some things fall more naturally into it than others. So maybe autism is something that might fall more naturally into this. If you think about, do you hallucinate or don't you? What is in between that? It's like, do you half hallucinate? Do you three-quarters hallucinate? What is that? And you could kind of go down the same route with synesthesia, couldn't you? I mean, I've argued this as well, that actually that you either have colours for letters and numbers or you don't. But actually, synesthesia itself isn't just having colourful letters and numbers. Synesthetes kind of think differently, so they have more stronger mental imagery. So if I ask you to think about a bonfire or think about touching fur, people differ in their ability to do this, but synesthetes are very good at doing this. They have other traits, like they're good at spotting kind of certain attention to detail. If you ask them to think of creative uses of a brick or a coat hanger, they do objectively better on these things. So I would say that synesthesia, although to some extent there are these binary things that you have or don't have, they kind of emerge from a whole set of other differences that themselves might kind of continuously vary throughout the population. And that's kind of how I would think about it. So, there are kind of certain traits that emerge, but they're emerging from a whole set of dispositions and biases that vary continuously from one person to another.
So, so you kind of mentioned that they have this unique ability to do certain things that certain people wouldn't be able to do. And would you say that could provide maybe cognitive benefits in their daily life?
When we've kind of asked synesthesia, so what are your strengths and weaknesses? I mean, there are certain things that come out of being better in memory and, good at learning languages, which I think is actually a memory thing as well. But they're also very good at perceptual discrimination, so spotting things that other people don't notice. And we don't find many weaknesses. I mean, synesthetes often report them, but typically we find that they're not very prominent with this. So it seems to be, a particular niche around certain abilities that go hand in hand with synesthesia. I mean, at that point, people say, well, why aren't we all synesthetes if it's beneficial? And, it might be beneficial for some members of the population to have these advantages and other members of the population to have that. And in effect, you're trying to keep your set of skills balanced, throughout the population rather than, being uber in one individual. It might also be the case that it does. It's a bit like sitting on a knife edge, that actually, you get the benefits, but you're at risk of certain other things. So we find that that synesthetes do have higher kind of certain autistic tendencies. There's evidence that they're more likely to have PTSD after a trauma. And again, why is this? Why having coloured letters and numbers make them more susceptible to PTSD? And my guess is it probably doesn't. It's something more around, if you've got very good memory and vivid, imagery, that in effect you're more prone to flashbacks, and having good memory is a good thing, but maybe there are things you want to forget. And in that case, is having good memory a good or a bad thing? I don't know. If you want to forget things, it's going to work against you, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess if you can kind of reconstruct a memory quicker, then I can see how that makes you more prone to flashbacks or traumatic events. I mean, so you mentioned also in one of your recent papers, you say that there's a genetic link between synesthesia and autism, and you kind of said this is something you already predicted. What's the kind of overlapping characteristics? And you've already kind of touched on it a bit, but I think there's a big overlap between the two.
Sure. I'm involved in kind of helping to collect genetic material, so just saliva samples from synesthetes. It's colleagues in the Netherlands who are looking at this. In terms of the actual kind of shared genes, we don't really have much in the way that's concrete, but we do know from kind of familial patterns that in effect autism and synesthesia are more likely to co-occur within the same families, and more so than other kind of control conditions that we looked at. So the genetic link, I would say, is still more suggestive rather than proven, but it would be hard to think of an obvious environmental account within the family that would give rise to the association.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously the classic defining symptoms of autism have historically been around social and communication problems. We do find that synesthetes can report that, but actually the thing that does stand out is around the heightened sensory sensitivity, and actually so finding sounds and lights aversive, tastes and smells, and not just the ones that are in their synesthesia. They find a whole range of things aversive, whether it participates in their synesthesia or not. Kind of an attentional differences, so attention to detail, distraction, and so on, are the ones that are kind of much more heightened. There are some things where they clearly do differ in ways that are kind of puzzling, but interesting puzzling. So autism is almost certainly more common in men than women. I mean, I think it is kind of biased by, you know, diagnosis and sampling, but even when that's taken into account, autism is more common in men than women. Synesthesia, not so. There is no gender bias. And in fact, we find that our female synesthetes are just as likely to be high in the autism spectrum as our males. They both get a kind of a boost. So again, this doesn't quite make sense, but the way that I would think about it is that, again, autism isn't just one thing, and nor is it just a linear thing. There are kind of a constellation of different traits, and some of those might be more closely linked to synesthesia than others, and some might be more closely linked to, you know, biological sex than others.
And what's your common lab techniques that you're taking to look into synesthesia?
Yeah, so I mentioned MRI and brain imaging. This would be one. Often, you know, it is kind of cognitive computer-based tests still that we do. And actually, we were doing this pre-coronavirus just because it's our way of getting larger samples over the internet. So because we're studying rare people, doing things online is still kind of very important for us. We are involved again in collecting genetic material from people with synesthesia, but this won't be analysed by our group at Sussex. There would be others looking at this. In the past, we've done other things like brain stimulation. So whether or not you can switch synesthesia kind of on or off by applying magnetic stimulation of the brain. There are a few studies on that, and we've done a couple over the years.
More relaxed question. If you could have a budget 10 times the size you have right now, and you could kind of go in harder into any area you want to go into, what would be your next big step? What would you want to find out most next?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I in terms of bigger science questions, I think it's the question you asked earlier about kind of what is a normal, if normal isn't one thing, then what is it? How would you actually go about funding that? Well, to some extent, I think that there is research out there that's doing this sort of thing. So there is something called the UK Biobank, which will have 100,000 kind of MRI scans in there, for example, that I could download. And the problem for me is that within that, they've not asked the questions that I would want them to ask. So, you know, it would be either adding the questions or starting again with your own, you know, biobank in which you're doing this. But I very much think that big data is the way forward. Making use of, you know, large data repositories where they have all the genetic material, they've got all the other things, but it's being able to ask the right questions, you know, around, you know, finding new ways of exploring how different people see the world. You know, whether some people kind of update their predictions a lot more, that they kind of see things kind of as they really are versus, you know, being biased by your own history and your own expectations, you know, whether there are these kinds of styles and whether these styles kind of map onto, I suppose, more classic conditions like autism, schizophrenia, and so on, having a more modern twist on that. So for me, those are the kind of the big science questions that kind of excite me.
Yeah, I can see that. It kind of makes me think, you know, you talk about these big data banks. I just was watching earlier the DeepMind, what's it called again? You know, the AI that managed to find the protein shape of all the proteins in the body or something crazy like that. I feel like maybe that's the next step. You know, you talked about this bank of these brain scans to be able to kind of use some sort of machine learning program to kind of decipher through them really quickly and find common traits, you know, pluck out these.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that I've tried to learn in recent years, is to do this. And it's very much the way forward is that people with backgrounds in psychology or biology either need to train themselves to do this, or they need to collaborate with people who can, step in and give them that advice. But yeah, so for example, with the 100 brains we did scan, we can find, biomarkers in the brain that look like synesthetes, like this person looks like they're a synesthete. We don't know for sure, but we might be able to go into these big data sets and interrogate them in that way.
Yeah, it's a step forward, but for sure you're right. I feel like it's quite an important thing to learn now. It's this kind of computer science integration. I feel like it's just going to become more and more important. So for the final question, if you could upgrade any part of your brain, what would you upgrade?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, at first it's like, oh no, take that one out, but it's like, no, why not? It's like, so yeah. I mean, at first I was going, oh yeah, your frontal cortex, so the kind of seat of reasoning and intelligence and all the rest. I think I kind of settled on keeping my hippocampus and keeping that big. I think to some extent, what are you without your memories and your kind of the thing that holds everything together? I mean, for me, I've been fortunate that we haven't had too much kind of Alzheimer's in the family, but it is so devastating. Is that I'm happy for my hippocampus to be supercharged and kind of set me up to maybe protect me in the future. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I would have gone for the same. So. Well, that's all I have, to be honest. But thank you so much for talking to me. It's really, really interesting. I love how you your inspiration came from that Oliver Sacks book, because I read it a couple of years ago, and I thought, because it's just loads of little stories, and they're all so interesting. The
exactly, that's right, yeah.
And I've forgotten most of the stories now. I might have to give it a read. Yeah. It's so interesting.
Yeah, on one level, it's not cutting edge science, but it doesn't need to be. It's just so inspiring, thought provoking, and what more do you need to get going in science than that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, thank you very much. I'll end the recording.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for great questions.